So let's dwell from patriarchy. Would you say like patriarchy is a thing from forever, or does it have like a starting point, and when would it be?
So I think, with the rise and decline of civilizations, patriarchy has gone up and down throughout history. You could go back to, say, Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, and the cloth producer Limassy, who was running her own business and producing cloth in 2000 BC. But then what happened about 300 years later was King Hammurabi. King Hammurabi, the famous, he features in the Bible, doesn't he, King Hammurabi? And he introduced probably the first legal system of patriarchy. So a guardianship system in which women became the property of men. Women became the property of their husbands or their fathers. And that really kind of constrained what women could do, because legally, if as a woman you do not exist, you can't sign contracts. So you can't set up your own business, you can't buy and sell anything other than, cheap, small, cheap things. So King Hammurabi has a lot to answer for, but I would say patriarchy, it's gone up and down. Patriarchy can work in different ways. Patriarchy looks different in different periods of history and in different parts of the world. So one of the examples that I talk about in the book is China. And in China, historically women were the people who produced the silk for the Silk Road that connected the Far East and Europe. And the Chinese state had a motto, and that was men plough and women weave. And Chinese taxes historically were paid in grain and also in cloth, in silk. So, Chinese women, so important historically in the Chinese economy. But what happened over time was that families found a way of trying to extract the value that women were creating, and that was through binding women's feet. And so, little girls would have their feet broken, turned in, bound, and what this did was to render, from a young age, women immobile, geographically immobile. They couldn't leave the family home and, go and get a job and earn their own money or start their own business. They had to live a life within the home, because with such tiny feet, moving was really painful. You can't go very far, very fast. And so, this was a social practice, a kind of patriarchal social practice that developed at the level of families that allowed male patriarchs to then essentially, it's like enslaving your daughters so that you can then effectively chain them to the spinning wheel. You don't need a chain because you've bound their feet. So where are you going to go? And so foot binding was a way that the patriarchy managed to extract the value that women created through cloth. And it took until the 20th century, really, for that practice to be brought to an end. And I think what's really interesting is, through the communist revolution in China, there was a real understanding that unless you abolish this practice, then you lack the economic power of half of your population.
It's obvious. It's obvious. So, for example, China was, as you said, like one civilization in which like women had an important economical role, and then eventually it was taken from her, and the civilization like declined. I would say maybe that's also a reason for the decline of the Roman civilization.
You're so right. And in the book, I talk about both the rise and the fall of the Roman world, and I put women into that story, inject women into that story. And I think, when you look at the rise of Italy, in that, we're talking about that first millennium BC. I think what was really striking to me was how relatively free women were in in the Roman world compared with, say, ancient Athens at the time
how
in
things
Greece.
like, for example, in ancient Athens?
Oh, so in ancient Athens, the guardianship system, instituted by King Hammurabi, hundreds of years before, there was a really strict guardianship system in ancient Athens.
So if you had to compare, for example, ancient Athens to a modern-day society, which one?
I think it would be quite close to Afghanistan.
Wow.
I'm going to say that controversially.
Wow.
But not only were women expected to stay within the home, they had to cover their hair.
Wow.
And so the most ancient depictions of the Greek equivalent of Venus, Aphrodite, the most ancient depictions of Aphrodite, she's veiled, she's clothed. Of course, crazy. A little later on, she uncovers her, her body, and the Romans really ran with the idea of a naked Venus, didn't they? I mean, the Roman women were renowned for their beautiful hairstyles. They didn't have to veil. And in fact, I was in the Prado Museum, and there's a wonderful sculptured walkway of sculptures of Roman heads of men and women. And the way that archaeologists date the Roman women is through the hairstyle. So unlike Athenian women, Roman women could uncover their hair. And I think that is in some ways, a sign of the freedom. Roman women were free to start businesses. They traded, wine and olive oil across the Mediterranean. And in fact, in the book, I talk about a trader called Celia from Roman times. And she traded Spanish wine and Spanish olive oil across the Mediterranean. Yes. And her mother did the same. So this is a multi-generational family of women traders in Roman times. So yes, I mean, in many ways, quite well. I'm not saying women's rights were perfect in Rome, and there were times when women really had to fight to maintain their rights.
Because you talk about like political infighting in that on this book too. Like people, women demonstrating because
women demonstrating. That's right, in the Roman Forum to maintain their rights. So during the time that Rome was fighting Carthage, so Carthage. I mean, it's one of my favourite trading empires of history, because the trading empire of Carthage, and of course Spain was a part of that maritime empire. This was an empire of equals. This was a commercial empire. This wasn't about, a crazy kind of political, power-driven, dictatorial-driven empire. This was an empire of equals that was about trade, peaceful trade across the Mediterranean. And, this... Carthage, this was a big competitor in the early rise of the Romans, and famously, of course, Hannibal travelled up through Spain and across the Alps to confront the Romans. And Hannibal was, he worried that Rome was going too far, and he wanted to defend the the freedoms of the Mediterranean. And during the wars with Carthage, the Roman state decided to try to restrict women's freedoms. And its argument was that this was to support the war effort. So, for example, it limited how much women could spend in the economy. It limited women's ability to move around in carriages, so like take taxis. It limited the types of clothes that women could wear, so they had to wear more simple clothes, not luxurious clothes. And the Roman state argued that this was all as part of the war effort. The problem was, once the wars with Carthage ended, those restrictions continued. And certainly, so Cato, the famous Roman statesman, said we need to maintain these restrictions on women's spending because it will stop women being in a spending competition with one another. That women can't be trusted to make decisions about their own money. So what happened was that Roman women gathered together in the Roman Forum and they protested. They protested to get back the right to spend, and they won. So this is a couple of hundred years BC. And so every time as a woman you go on a shopping spree, you can thank that protest in Rome, 200 BC, roughly.